Hi, welcome to the Writing Across Emory workshop, Teaching the Basics of Data Journalism. My name is Mai Nguyen, and I'll be guiding you through this presentation today. A brief introduction about me. I'm affiliated with the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods, as well as the Emory Writing Center, where I hold seminars on technical writing and data analysis. I received my PhD from New York University in political science with a specialization in quantitative methodologies as well as comparative politics. Prior to coming to Emory, I worked as the quantitative editor at FiveThirtyEight, which is a data journalism website that specializes in politics and sports, and they're especially known for their election predictions. In addition to my role at Emory, I also work as a data scientist at a software company based out of Arlington, Virginia, called Giant Oak. Some other fun facts about me: I was born and raised in Nebraska. I really enjoy the Great British Bake Off and baking in general, and I have a ridiculous collection of board games, about 50 and counting. So the purpose of this workshop is to provide you with an introduction to help you incorporate data journalism into the classroom. This presentation is the first part of a two-part series, and today I will be focusing on how to think about data. The second part will be offered in the spring and will cover more tips and resources on communicating data, specifically discussing things such as data visualizations and data writing. So just a roadmap for this presentation. I'm going to be discussing broadly what data journalism is and the skills that I think are required to be a good data journalist. As well as more broadly, I'm going to talk about how to think about data. This includes things such as the data generation process, data measurement, types of data stories, and some potential pitfalls to look out for when doing data analysis. So let's begin. What is data journalism? So I take a fairly broad view of what data journalism is and define it simply as any storytelling that involves data. Data journalism can come in many forms. It can be as simple as the AJC reporting on how many people voted this week in Georgia, all the way to the more complicated and intensive election prediction modeling you see in places like the New York Times or FiveThirtyEight. And data can be introduced in various parts of the journalism process. It can be used early on and used to help reporters find leads for in-depth investigations. Think about a lot of the work that's done at ProPublica, where they do a lot of data work at the front end and then do in-depth field reporting on specific topics and specific profiles. Data can also be used to support arguments in stories through things such as data visualizations or statistics, and data can even be stories themselves. So one of my favorite genres of data journalism are stories about the data collection process or flaws with data. This is something that has become more relevant lately, especially as we grapple with how to get reliable information on COVID and things such as that. But no matter what form or guise it takes, I do think there are certain skills that are important and able to produce good data journalism. Now, what skills are those? Well, I want to bring up this tweet from my former boss at FiveThirtyEight, Nate Silver. This tweet was from October of last year, but I find it extremely relevant still. And in it here, Nate contends that in order to be a good data scientist or a good data journalist, one should spend most of their time honing their statistical intuition and domain knowledge, and only a small part of the time on methods per se. So contrary to what many people may think, it's not actually the intensive programming or modeling skills that matter most for a data journalist, but rather it's one's ability to ask good questions of the data and apply that to something important or something that matters. And I completely agree with this. For me, the greatest data journalists I know and the greatest data scientists I know are not necessarily the ones with the best programming skills, who know the best methods in Python or R, or who know the most fancy machine learning techniques. It's the ones who can think critically about what the data are actually telling us and apply it to something that matters. Now, that's not to say that statistical skills are irrelevant, but more so there's power in simple summary statistics, and in reality, right now, most people already have the potential to create good data stories. And what I think really determines one's ability to produce good data journalism is the ability to really understand data and think critically about it. And so that's what I want to spend the rest of the time and bulk of my time here talking about today. That is how to think about data. The first part of how to think about data is understanding the data generation process. So let's start off with, what is data? Simply put, data is information that is collected together for the purpose of examination, discussion, or calculation. Now, the key part I want to highlight here is that data is constructed by people. Data does not come down from the heavens, dropped into our laps by some data gods to be taken as infallible. Data is constructed, it's been put together, it's collected, it's generated by people. And as we all know, people are not perfect. We are flawed beings. We all have different incentives and different backgrounds. So data in itself is political, it's social, it's economic, it's everything. And as such, there's always a healthy dose of skepticism that is needed. So to illustrate this point, I want to present to you a fun fact. This fun fact is there are no Hispanic people in the United States prior to 1970. Now this is according to the US Census Bureau. Okay, at this point you may be saying to yourself, well, Mai, that's ridiculous and can't possibly be true. And of course you're right. Of course there are people, Hispanic and Latino people living in the US prior to 1970. However, if you were to look at the data, this is exactly the case. We have no record of it. And the reason for this is because the US Census Bureau didn't actually consistently start including a question about Hispanic or Latino origin until 1970, right? So the point of this example is to highlight the fact that we can't measure something that we have not conceptualized. This is the first part in understanding the data generating process. That is, in order for data to exist, in order for something or someone, some person had to decide that it was necessary or valuable to start recording something, right? So in 1970, someone at the Census Bureau decided that it was important to keep track of the number of people with Hispanic or Latino backgrounds who are living in the US. So even after we've deemed something important to collect, there are many issues that come about when it comes to operationalizing and measuring concepts. So in 1970, the US Census Bureau decided it was important to record how many people of Hispanic or Latino origin there were, but then there came problems with how to define those concepts and to count those people, right? The idea of operationalizing and measuring that concept. So I want to talk to these problems of operationalization and measurement. I want to present another example, and that example is hate crimes. So the idea of hate crimes is an important topic that has been receiving a lot of attention, especially recently this year with a lot of protests and Black Lives Matter protests. Much of the existing data that we have on hate crimes comes from the FBI. So let's think about hate crimes and the data generation process from the perspective of the FBI. So first, someone at the FBI had to decide that it was worthwhile to start collecting data on hate crimes, which seems pretty obvious, and that would be important, so I don't think that was a huge decision that had to be made. It was just made. But the second part of that is how to define hate crimes. And this is where we can first introduce some problems. So the FBI broadly defines a hate crime as a traditional offense like murder, arson, or vandalism with an added element of bias. And specifically, they go on to say a hate crime is any criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. So right off the bat, we can already see how there can be problems with this operationalization. What does whole versus in part mean? Is there some threshold one must pass in order to be determined a hate crime? Is it half of the crime is based on bias, or is it 1/10 of the crime is based on bias? And how would one determine the intent was due to a perpetrator's bias? Does the person who's committing the crime have to literally express it from their mouth, such sentiment? Other things, is it a hate crime if the bias is only part of one of these categories of race or religion? Does it have to be multiple ones? Who decided these categories in the first place and not other categories? So clearly, you can already see here when we're talking about something as complicated as hate crimes, there are a lot of elements that may be included or not included, and someone had to make these decisions on what to define it as. And these decisions are not made in a vacuum, and there are a lot of implications to those decisions. But putting that aside, let's move on from the operationalization of hate crimes. Let's say the FBI came up with the perfect, most flawless definition of hate crimes. The next part is how to measure or collect that information. And so how the FBI actually collects its data is through reporting from local jurisdictions and police or sheriff's agencies. So each year, as part of its uniform crime reporting, the FBI depends on reports from thousands of agencies across the country, and they just aggregate it. But of course, this introduces a lot of problems in its own right, because some places may have different procedures and standards for how they themselves keep track of this information, and may slightly differ in terms of their definition of hate crime. So what if some places are better at reporting than others? What if some places have broader definitions, or some places have, less broad definitions? And this is actually indeed the case what happens and where a lot of problems with the hate crimes data comes in. So in 2017, ProPublica actually did a story on where hate crimes get underreported. And they found that there's a lot of variation in how different areas report out their hate crime statistics. So take, for example, Houston, which is one of the largest cities in the country. They only reported 8 hate crimes. Or take another example of Jacksonville, Florida, and they haven't reported a hate crime since 2014. Now, does this mean that there are very little or no hate crimes in these places? Probably not. It's probably due to some quirk in the data reporting up to the FBI. But the point here I want to make is that throughout the whole data generating process, there are multiple decisions that had to be made and several steps where things can go wrong. Now, understanding this is vitally important because it has implications for what we can and cannot say about the data. And this is unfortunately something that's often overlooked in many stories I've seen that uses this FBI hate crimes data. I've seen many stories written using the FBI data, conflating hate crimes with specifically race-based crimes. Is this right? Maybe, but from what we know about the definition of hate crimes, it includes things other than race. It includes gender and sexual orientation discrimination. So conflating it with race-based crimes on its own, they may not be accurate. Or what if reporters make comparisons between cities and conclude something like Houston has less issues or fewer issues with hate crimes than, say, Chicago? Is this a sound conclusion? Probably not, because we know that there may be some issues with the reporting and the numbers that you're seeing aren't necessarily based on underlying hate crime rates in these cities, but rather just the reporting rates. So really to drive home this point of the importance of understanding where your data comes from, I want to talk to you about a story that I personally worked on. So prior to coming to FiveThirtyEight, the website published a story concerning broadband access in the US. It's a very important topic, and there are very large disparities in broadband access, which then has knock-on effects for things such as education and labor. And so the reporters at FiveThirtyEight had the idea to look at some data and use it to identify leads for on-the-ground reporting. One thing they found in the data was that Washington D.C. has very low levels of broadband access, and this is like orders of magnitude lower. You can see here in this chart that the share of adults with fast internet connections by county or by area, most of it is around 50 or 60%, whereas in the District of Columbia, it's less than 30%. So the writers of the story found this to be very interesting. They wrote a whole story about the lack of broadband in DC, and they went out and did some reporting, interviewing people in DC who didn't have broadband access. The story was published, writing about this fact, but then shortly after it was published, the writers started receiving a lot of emails questioning this statistic from people in DC, from people who are in the know about broadband access, and they feel that this statistic isn't right and there's something going on with the data. So when I started my job at FiveThirtyEight, my first assignment, I was tasked with investigating this. And let me tell you, boy, was it a doozy, and it's quite a story, and I'm gonna walk you through it. So what I had to do was I had to go through a deep dive to figure out where these numbers were coming from and why so many people were telling us that it was wrong. So to start off with, the data that the writers used at FiveThirtyEight came from some academics at ASU and Iowa University. The figures were estimates. According to the academics, these figures that we used were estimates of the proportion of the county that has a computer and high-speed internet access, right? So the first thing I did was check it against other sources that attempt to measure the same thing. Now, two other sources that are useful for this are one, the American Community Survey, which is part of the US Census Bureau, and they survey people regularly, and then the FCC. Now, both of these places have different ways of trying to measure broadband access. For example, the ACS uses survey data and asks people individually, whereas the FCC actually uses data directly from internet service providers. So there are some discrepancies, some differences expected between these different data sources. However, all these three places are trying to measure the same concept, that is access to high-speed broadband internet. And so numbers shouldn't be drastically different. But that's exactly what we find, right? When you compare the academics data from ASU and Iowa, the one that FiveThirtyEight used, those numbers are quite different from the ACS and from the FCC. So for the DC example, the ASU Iowa data had it at 28.8%, whereas from the ACS and from the FCC, those numbers are closer to 70, much closer to each other at 70%. So right off the bat, you know that there's something wrong. There is something wrong with the data. We can dive in further and look at how the ASU Iowa numbers are different, not uniformly lower or anything like that, but for different counties, some are higher, some are lower. In addition to that, the ASU Iowa data has a pretty weak relationship with median household income, which if you're talking about broadband internet access, you would think that there should be a relationship between income, where places that tend to have wealthier tend to have more access to broadband internet. That's not the relationship that was shown in the ASU data, but that was the relationship that was shown in the ACS and FCC. So doing this deep dive, doing this sanity check, we realized there's something wrong with ASU Iowa data. The next question then is why? So the team of FiveThirtyEight writers and myself, we went back and did some in-depth interviews with the researchers from ASU and Iowa to get to the bottom of this. We spoke to them, and it turns out that they purchased their data from a place called Catalyst, which Catalyst is actually a very well-known data provider. They worked with a lot of organizations, a lot of political campaigns. They keep a lot of information on voter files and things like that. So they're actually a pretty well-known organization, and they have a pretty good reputation. But we decided to talk to them, and we interviewed them about this measure, this data that they sold the academics at ASU and Iowa. We talked to them, we tried to probe them about where this data came from, what the data actually represents, is it actually a good measure for broadband? We talked to them, and it came to light actually that it wasn't data that they had on their own or that they collected on their own. It came from a company called InfoUSA, which InfoUSA is a large marketing data provider. They collect a lot of information for telemarketing companies, essentially. And what happened was InfoUSA refused to talk to us, but we did get some information on what the data was. It turns out the numbers that the academics were given from InfoUSA that was then channeled through Catalyst, that then was given to the ASU, and then that was used for FiveThirtyEight, was actually based on this. And it's a measure that denotes it denotes interest in high-tech products and or services as reported via ShareForce. This would include personal computers and internet service providers blended with modeled data. So as you can tell, it's quite different from what was expected and probably not the definition of broadband internet access that we would think it should be. At FiveThirtyEight, we ended up having to write a 2,000-word retraction article laying out everything we found about the data and how we shouldn't have used it. And the basic lesson, the hard lesson learned here is that a basic understanding and diligence about the data generation process could have saved a lot of time and heartache for many people involved. Understanding how the data were generated, specifically knowing how things were defined and measured and how they were different, how they were conveyed to each person involved in the pipeline, and then understanding how the data was actually collected. Additionally, performing sanity checks and cross-reference against other data sources. These are things that I learned through this process and things that I want to pass on to you for your students or your own data analysis. But the key takeaway is that doing all this, understanding the data generation process is extremely valuable and has a lot of implications for the stories you can and can't write. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's say you've done the initial checks and making sure you know where their data comes from and you're confident of your data provenance. Let's discuss some basic stuff you can do with that data now. There are many types of data stories, but here are a few basic types. Now note that these are not all the possible types and that these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, many data stories include multiple elements of these and combine these. I just want to go through some very basic basic types of data stories that you or your students can do without a lot of advanced stats or programming needed. So first one is measurement. Measurement stories basically are simple, straightforward reports of simple summary statistics. This example from the LA Times just tells readers how many confirmed cases and deaths of coronavirus there are in California at a specific point in time. So measurement stories can come in something similar like this with a table or graphic, or simply stated in text, but simply it's just saying one number, saying one statistic, and then saying something about it or telling a story around that. The second type is trend stories. And trend stories basically just tell people how something changes over time. This example on the screen here comes from the Washington Post and tracks the number of coronavirus cases in the US since March. Pretty straightforward. The next type of story is a comparison story. Comparison stories do exactly as it says. They compare data across different units. Now it can be across geographic locations like this one does from the Financial Times that looks at coronavirus deaths across different countries. But the comparison stories can also be comparisons of groups or groups of people or time periods, anything really, but you're trying to make some comparison between different subsets of the data. Similarly related are factors or composition analyses. And this is, these type stories just break down or subset the data in meaningful ways and try to draw some information from them. So here's an example using CDC data, and this story attempts to break down the age groups of coronavirus deaths. You can see here, most of the deaths that occur from coronavirus are people aged 85 or older. There are very low amounts of people younger than 4. And there's some in between that 65, 75, and then 55, 64 range. And then finally, there's a story type called relationships. And relationship stories are probably the more common one, or the ones that are the most interesting, in the sense that people are trying to make some conclusion or draw some connections between different concepts and facets of the data. This example right here is a story from Pew Research Center. It's just trying to show a relationship between political affiliation and attitudes towards the coronavirus. And so here from this graphic, we can see that it tends to be, if you're a Democrat, you have higher levels of concern about COVID-19 as a major threat to the health of the US public as compared to US adults overall and as compared to Republicans. So again, trying to draw this relationship between political affiliation and concern over coronavirus. Like I said, a lot of the stories that you'll come across are some combinations of these different types of stories. And a lot of them are going to try to build on this idea of relationship and trying to find relationships. Now, all these different types of data stories are interesting and relevant in their own ways. And these stories, I would contend, make up the majority of data stories that we see today. But what I really want to highlight is that all these types of stories don't necessarily require a lot of knowledge on advanced statistical techniques. What they require is a basic understanding of data, and more importantly, how to frame questions that are important to readers. This reiterates the fact that the most important thing is really understanding your data and knowing what the data are really telling us. And so let's go over some potential pitfalls or things to look out for when you're trying to create these different types of data stories and looking at relationship within data. Everyone knows this. And so basically the oldest adage that comes about, and it's the first and most basic critique when it comes to data analysis. And it certainly is true, right? Correlation does not imply causation. Yes. But what I want to encourage you, and I want to encourage you to reiterate to your students, is to think further about this. And the more important question is to understand why. Why is it that correlation does not imply causation? Now this is a pretty standard example, and we're looking here at the relationship between ice cream sales and shark attacks. What we see here is that there's a high correlation or relationship between these two things. And one would be tempted to make the conclusion that something like eating ice cream will cause you to get attacked by sharks. Of course, we know that at face value, that's silly and that's not true. But what you're really seeing is that what's causing this relationship and this correlation is that during the summer, more people buy ice cream, and also during the summer, more people tend to go swimming, thus increasing the chances of getting attacked by sharks. And so that's why we see this trend. So the time of year or summer is what we call a confounder. A confounding variable or confounder is a variable that influences both the independent variable and dependent variable and leads to a spurious correlation. So in this case, independent variable being ice cream, dependent variable being shark attacks, and the confounding variable is summer. Now this is important to understand because this actually comes up a lot. A lot of data stories attempt to make causal arguments and will often run into a problem of confounders. So this second example I want to show you is actually a satirical piece from some academics that created this really interesting and funny, entertaining chart, but it actually got picked up by some news outlets as serious. What they were trying to show is this idea that there are a lot of confounders that exist and trying to highlight spurious correlations. What they plot here is there's a connection between chocolate consumption and winning Nobel Prizes. So countries that have higher per capita chocolate consumption also tend to have a higher number of Nobel laureates per 10 million people by population, right? But the thing here is it's a very high correlation about these two things, but it doesn't mean that eating chocolate will increase your chances of winning a Nobel Prize. Now, wouldn't that be nice if it were true? Obviously, it's not though. Instead, there are probably confounding issues at play here. What could a potential confounder be here? There are many, but probably one is wealth, where wealthier countries tend to have higher rates of chocolate consumption because there are more people with money to spend. And then also wealthier countries are able to invest more money in education and research, which therefore would actually lead them to get more Nobel Prizes. So this idea of confounders comes up, like I said, a lot, and it's something to keep out keep a lookout for both in your own writing and your own data analysis, as well as students when introducing them to data analysis, to be aware of the idea of confounders and where it comes up. Now, another thing to look for is broadly what I call issues with selection. And here I think it's useful to go over several examples. So the first issue of selection comes from a story from the New York Times. In this New York Times story, the writer talks to 300 high achievers, asks them about their morning routines, and then makes some conclusions that people should adopt certain habits to become better achievers. Now, the problem here is what we call selecting on the dependent variable. The problem here is that the reporter only talked to high achievers, so we don't have a proper counterfactual or comparison group. So you may talk to a bunch of overachievers and say you find that all of them brush their teeth in the morning. So then you can draw a conclusion and wrongly say that brushing your teeth will help you lead to do better, to achieve higher in education or a job or whatever it is. But this is simply not true. These habits may not actually be what makes people overachievers. You really don't know what the differences are unless you look at everyone, that is over and underachievers. And so this is the first issue of selection, which is selecting again on the dependent variable what you're trying to explain, but not actually having a proper comparison group. And this actually may come up more often than you think. But this is a part of what I said, an issue with selection. Now the second example comes from FiveThirtyEight, again published before I was there a long time ago, but this graphic shows the breakdown of how people order their steak and contends that Americans writ large like their steaks medium. So this is egregious on multiple levels. First, I'm from Nebraska, we eat a lot of beef, and growing up, no one should ever order their steak medium. That's just ridiculous. It's medium rare or bust. But secondly, and more seriously, if you look closely at the survey, it's a survey of steak orders from Longhorn Steakhouse. Now this is problematic because you're looking at a population that is very specific and may not actually be representative of the whole US population. So this is a sample selection problem. And basically the data you're looking for isn't actually representative of the population that you're trying to make an inference or trying to make some conclusion about. This is also something that is pretty common where people will take data kind of out of context essentially and try to apply it to a larger population. That is also an issue with selection, specifically sample selection. Now another example of a selection issue is one that's more subtle, but it comes from this example in Vox. So this story came as part of a larger series looking at disparities between representation of men and women holding political office. Now, this graphic shows that non-incumbent women running for office actually tend to win more than their non-incumbent male counterparts. And this was for the primary elections in 2018. And looking at this has led some people to come to the conclusion that voters really don't have a problem electing women and dispel some of the myths of gender bias in voting. However, there's a very specific selection problem going on in here, in that women don't tend to run as often as men because of fear of gender bias in elections, because of fear that because they're women, they won't be, voters will view them differently, and therefore they don't run. And so the women who do decide to run for office tend to be more qualified than the ones who have not decided to. And so the ones who are more qualified, they select into running or being a candidate because they feel that they have the credentials to compete, whereas men don't necessarily face that barrier to entry. And so the portion of men who come in may not be as qualified or may have a different background than the women that come in. So like I said, this issue of selection is pretty subtle, but important because I don't think the conclusion that should be drawn here is that there's no gender bias in politics. It's rather highlighting that there are certain places in the pipeline, and if you're looking at your data analysis at one portion of that, you may be missing out on a broader story, which is beforehand of who selects into who decides to actually run. And this can happen in other contexts as well, but this is a very common one that comes up. Another potential pitfall or thing to look out for or to be aware of is cherry picking, or essentially looking at only things that support your argument. So take, for example, this generated time series data. And you can think about it, it can represent stock prices, it can represent GDP, it can represent something like batting averages in sports, whatever. But if you're only to focus on one end of the series, some conclusions could be drawn about rapid growth or some type of upward trajectory. But in reality, what's really going on is just that it's the numbers returning to normal levels, or what we can call mean reversion. And you're just only highlighting the portion that's out of context, you're placing it out of context. This is especially pertinent, and we actually see this quite often in news stories today when it comes to discussing economic recovery in the US. Finally, an important question to keep in mind is, what am I really identifying? Now, no presentation would be complete without an XKCD image, and so I pulled this one that I really do enjoy. This one does a good job of highlighting something simple but fairly prevalent in data journalism. So it notes a huge pet peeve, which is geographic maps, which are basically just population maps. It shows a series of maps connecting a website's users, Freud pornographer, consumers, and subscribers to Martha Stewart Living, and says the implications are clear. What it's highlighting is just that places with more people are going to always be highlighted no matter what you're looking at, just because there are more people there, and these are just population maps. And you'd be actually surprised. It's pretty simple, but you'd be surprised how often it comes up. And so, for example, take this article. This is an old political article from 2017. And this story tries to make a connection between Trump voters and the lack of media consumption. Now, I'm sure there are sophisticated arguments to be made about this connection between media consumption and how it differs between political party and Trump versus non-Trump voters. And there may be some truth to it. However, what this is showing is just showing that the rural areas that voted for Trump, which is true, and that there are lower numbers of print and digital media circulation, which would make sense because there are fewer people and fewer news outlets in rural counties. It's problematic because there's no adjustment for population, and possibly you may think that if you do adjust for population, we could see some different conclusions. But this just kind of highlights the idea that, really identify, really understand what you're trying to identify, and really understand what the data is telling you. Is it just a population map? Are you just like measuring population here? So kind of to wrap things up, am I doomed? If I run into any of these problems, is my data story doomed and should I quit? And the answer is, of course not. Data and data analysis is never, ever perfect. And I wanted to highlight a lot of problems here that we have just so that you're aware of it. But it's not to say that, that there is perfect data analysis out there, because there isn't. Every single data analysis and data story will have its problems. But the point is to understand the limits of what we can and can't say, understand what those problems are, and understand what the implications for the conclusions you can draw are. Most importantly, it's about being honest about the potential flaws of what we do. It provides credibility, and it enhances your story. If there are ever stories or data journalism stories that claim to be perfect or claim to not have any flaws, I immediately will discount it because that's just simply not true. It never happens that way. So don't be afraid of the flaws, acknowledge them, embrace them, and try to figure out what you can say, including those flaws. And sometimes finding and investigating flaws actually leads to good data projects on our own. Like I said, one of my favorite types of data journalism stories or genres these days is finding flaws in data, figuring out where they came from, and trying to figure out or make guesses of how to collect data better. So with all this in mind, I hope this provides a good introduction for you, good things to think about on how to think about data and how to introduce working with data to your students. Like I said, I have another series coming up in the spring, and please join me for that for more about the specifics of communicating data, data visualization, and data writing. Otherwise, thank you for joining me.